So, how are you guys feeling today? Not too beat up or broken down from yesterday? I woke up today and my shins were a little sore just from doing some of the ankle mobs, so I know that some of you in here are probably a little bit tender too. Today is going to be advanced core. Just so you guys know, we're going to do a lot of hands-on stuff. We're going to go through progressions and continuums, so it's not going to be just sitting here and being in lecture the entire time. Also, as you notice, we got a camera crew here, and everybody who's here is going to get a free copy of the full set when it's all released. So I'll go through PayPal, get your mailing address, and send it to you. So that way you don't have to worry about paying. My gift to you guys, just make sure you see that I'm appreciative of you being here and helping out with that. And I know you're going to get lots of knowledge from it too, so hopefully that helps. I put this slide up yesterday just to say, this is who I am, and if you want more information, where you can find me. Also, being Canadian, I feel I do have to apologize for Justin Bieber. Anywhere I go, it's like my Canadian politeness. I kind of have to apologize for people that are making Canada a bad place. On top of that, I also kind of have to apologize for Nickelback because they're from Alberta, and actually if you think from Edmonton down to Hanna, Alberta, which is where they're from, is about 3.5 hours, 3 hours and 50 minutes, which is about how long it takes to get from LaGuardia into Manhattan during rush hour on a Friday night. I found that out this week, so that was always fun. Being from Edmonton, I also live in a place where the air hurts my face half the year. So I don't know why I still live there, especially when there's places that have been like LA and San Diego and obviously New York, which are much more temperate climates. I mean, Boston's a more temperate climate than Edmonton sometimes, and especially this year you guys are getting a lot of snow, but even then, it's still fun to be able to live in Edmonton and be able to tell people, yeah, I come from -40, but we can't really complain too much because cold is cold, but then you get 6 to 9 to 15 feet of snow, and that's not fun for anybody. I mean, when the entire city has to shut down, I can't really complain too loudly. At the end of the day, though, being a trainer is pretty much one of the best gigs you'd have. So you can do it anywhere you want, and you just party like a rock star. So hopefully you guys are able to see that this is something that I love to do, but it's also fun. And hopefully you guys find that it's fun too. There's a lot of science, there's a lot of thinking, and a lot of critical analysis behind it. But at the end of the day, we work in gyms, we play, we have fun. We should be able to enjoy every aspect of what we do. Now, as far as why we need to have core stability, there's a lot of people that say, oh, I don't need core work, I don't need core work. Okay, you might not need core work, but are you winning every game you play? Or are you doing everything you want to do? Or do you live pain-free? If not, you probably need more core work. And core work isn't just about training your rectus, training your obliques, training anything like that. We're going to go through a really expansive view of what the core is and how we train it by using not just like the muscles, but also reactive neural training, breathing modalities, all sorts of different fun things that we can start kicking into. Special thanks, I already put this up, but Jeff Hallaby, Nick Johnson, Hallaby Life, everybody in here who's been helping out to make the facility run smoothly, make everything work really well. My lovely wife for putting up with me and running some of the back-end administrative work. The quiet, non-honking cabbies in the city of New York, I know that they're kind of a fun treat to have. We went over to London and did a seminar over there, and Tony was saying, man, I can't believe how quiet it is here when nobody's honking. And in London, everyone's like, really? They honk all the time. But I guess it's all relative, right? My wife reining in the shopping slightly. Yesterday was a bit of a rough day. I'm waiting to see what the damage is when we get back, but she came back with a couple of bags and she's like, look, I had fun. Oh, okay. Customs officials are always fun to do too. If you ever get the chance, offer the pat down. It's always nice to have a little bit of physical contact when you're traveling, make me feel loved. And always Optimus Prime. I mean, you can't defeat the guy who's the best in the world and what he does in the universe. So. I also put this quote up yesterday, but it's one of the great things that I love to use whenever I talk about anything related to fitness. Bruce Lee, consciousness of self is the greatest hindrance of proper execution of all physical action. There is no fixed teaching. All I can provide is the appropriate medicine for a particular ailment. This stuff works when it works. When you use it on the right population for the right goal, it works. If you use it just with everybody in a group, it's not going to work that well because it's designed to be specifically for individuals. And it's designed at specific levels of ability. If you start taking people through a strength and reactive neural training program, when they're barely at the integrated level, they're going to have some problems and you're not going to have a good session. They might even get injured. Whereas if you have high-level athletes that have no pain and they need to compete, and you get them doing reactive breathing and dead bugs and stuff like that, that might not get them where they want to go. As to methods, there may be a million and then some, but principles are few. The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble. Again, these exercises and the progressions that we use, you can choose which ones you want to use and you can choose which ones you want to throw away. If you have better ways of doing it, great, use them. If you understand the principles of how they organize and how they progress, that's where you're going to need to be in order to see success with all of your programming. Once you know how the box is shaped, then you can decide whether to stay in the box or think outside of the box. So what is the core? Let's take a look at some of the basic anatomy and some of the concepts within. When we look at the core, we always think muscular anatomy. We always think rectus, obliques, internal, external, transverse, multifidi, erector spinae, psoas, iliacus. The two are different. I hate the word iliopsoas because there's actually two distinct muscles and two distinct sheaths. They don't blend. Then we can look into other aspects of things like the latissimus dorsi, glute maximus, glute medius minimus, all that kind of stuff. Crunches, it does work a portion of your core, but even then, there's so many better ways of doing it. Why would we want to just relegate ourselves to a core exercise that's very low level, but high risk in some populations? When we look at how the core is shaped, we can consider it in a couple of different ways. There's an outer unit, which is all the superficial muscles that we see, so the rectus, the obliques, the glutes, the lats, pecs, everything like that. Then there's the deep muscles, the inner unit. These are ones that guys like Paul Chek and Vladimir Yandev described as the ones like the diaphragm, the pelvic floor, the transverse abdominis, the deep multifidi, all those muscles. Then we start getting into what the actual goal of those muscles is to produce lumbar stability. So we can muscularly contract any of those individual muscles to a certain degree, but what does that do to the end result? We can make a muscle strong, but does it function well? At the end of the day, we have to be able to get people to stand, move, and do stuff, regardless of how strong an individual muscle is or isn't. If they can move well, produce stability when they need to, and be able to move, that's the end goal. So I usually use an example of a tennis ball when I talk about the core. Everyone's heard about like the balloon theory of the core, any of that kind of stuff. If we consider a tennis ball, when it bounces, it goes through a deformation phase. You throw a ball at the ground, it hits it, there's elastic energy stored within the ball, it expands when it hits the ground, and then it recoils to produce force. When we see people doing a squat, normally their abdomen will expand and then contract back in. When they breathe, same aspect. We can see people go through really big deformational changes. If you've ever seen Frank Zane when he does any bodybuilding shows, he gets this great vacuum effect going on where you can pretty much see the front of his spine by the time he's done with that thing. So the abs have a great ability to deform and reform. Now if we take that tennis ball and we take a knife and we cut into it, does that tennis ball still bounce? Yeah, it'll still bounce. Like, grab a tennis ball, you bounce that thing, it's gonna bounce. Does it bounce as high as it did before when there wasn't that cut in the ball? No, but it'll still bounce. You can cut half of that tennis ball open. You throw it at the ground, will it still bounce? A little bit. So the controlled coordination and the elasticity of the entire ball is what's going to allow it to have that big recoil. You start disrupting that elastic integrity of the entire ball, and that's where you're not going to see the bounce come quite so high. And we can see this in people if they've had abdominal surgery, if they've had natural childbirth or cesarean childbirth, if they have pelvic floor dysfunctions, if they have diastasis in the rectus abdominis, anything where there's a disruption of the abdominal cavity, we can see that the core strength is reduced due to the fact that there's been a tear in that elastic membrane or in that elastic integrity of the entire structure. So when we use the core, if we were to think about that as a balloon example, we pop a hole in that balloon, what happens to the entire balloon? It's dead, right? If we go into surgery for our abdomen, are we dead? No, we hopefully can still move around and do stuff, and that core can still fire up. But if we have minor disruptions to it, it still works, but it's working at a limited capacity now. So the best core is the one that involves all muscles and has that co-contractive elasticity going all the way around. So if we can get the entire core to function as a unit, that's where we get the best results for any kind of core training program. So what does that core actually do? They're not really aligned to produce a huge amount of force. If you think about the muscular attachments of the rectus, it's bump, 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 and they're interconnected with fascial lines. Then the obliques are coming in the same direction, they interconnect with fascial lines, they connect ribs to the pelvis and then control up and down. So if we think about a muscle that's designed to produce force or velocity, what do you think some of the characteristics of those muscles would be? Think of something like your pec or your bicep. They usually attach over two joints, which would be a major one if you want to produce velocity. They're usually also a single pennant muscle where it just kind of stretches in one direction and there's cords going through it. Your hamstrings are a great example of that as well. So you want a speed muscle, it's usually crossing two joints and it's usually a unipennant muscle. If you want a muscle that's able to produce multiple directions of force and multiple types of contraction, what would you think the characteristics of that muscle would be? It's usually going to have cross membranes going on where you have multiple directions of application. Think about sort of like the warp and weave of a tire. It's not just rubber moving in one direction. They have multiple directions, overlays, and layers to that tire as far as the nylon that's used inside in the rubber, because that produces the strength and the stability for it to bow out but also produce traction. Your abdomen is designed very much the same way. There's a way higher concentration of slow twitch muscle fibers per square inch than power producing muscles. When you think about the abs, if you're standing up, how long do those muscles have to be firing for? They have to fire the entire time. And then when you're not doing an exercise, they still have to fire. When you do an exercise, they have to clamp right down and then release. So they have to be very, very endurance based. You get people that have low back pain, there's a lot of correlation studies that have shown if you can't hold a back extension for 2 minutes, you're at a really high risk of developing a back injury just by holding a plank. The back endurance is really huge. Most attachments are to other muscles or fascial networks. When you look at how the rectus and the obliques work, they don't just work to attach one bone to another bone. They usually attach into fascial networks in the front, the back, the sides, or how many warp and weave lines are running through the body. So when we see something like that, the role isn't to create movement, but to create stability, stiffness, and a transfer of force from the lower body to the upper body and from the upper body to the lower body. They want to stabilize the spine, but also produce power from one section to another. So if you have a really weak core and I try to drive off my leg to maybe throw a baseball, what's going to happen to the force production up here if my core isn't strong enough to push the force from my leg to my upper body? I'm going to buckle. And you're going to wind up with people developing buckling type injuries. So if you're deadlifting with a flexed spine, you have to lock that down, otherwise you buckle. And at that point, that's where injury starts to happen. So if we look at some of the anatomical features on cadaver studies, you can see like these are individual muscle lines with fascial networks in between. And then on the side, there's the fascial networks that connect obliques into rectus. And then there's deep lines that run underneath that interconnect everything together. So when you contract your rectus, you have to contract your obliques, you have to contract your transverse to be able to pull everything into place to make those fascial networks actually align. We have the serratus muscles over here, those big finger projections that attach your shoulder blade into your obliques and then down through here. So if you go like this and protract your shoulders and contract the serratus, you actually contract your rectus too. They have to pull together. If we look at the superficial layers of fascia, like that's a thick, thick band of fascia right on top of the muscle. So it's kind of a force transducer from one muscle group to another. They're going to interconnect and interrely on each other. So if we're working on isolation type exercises, we're kind of missing the boat on how a lot of this works. Now if we get right down into the grundle area, like where the rectus sheath attaches down into the adductor groups, like you can see there's very little differentiation from one to another. The attachment point for the distal portion of the rectus here, and then the adductor longus are pretty much in the same spot. So you think about right down at the bottom of the pubic symphysis, that's a massive attachment point for a lot of muscles and a lot of areas that are going to be just interconnected with itself. So if you have a contraction of your abs, you have to contract your rectus too, or your adductor longus. Everything is kind of interconnected around the abs, around the pelvis. You can do isolated contractions, but you got to really work at not doing much. If we're up and moving around in the world, we have to do everything. We have to get everything to co-contract and move with it. Now, a fun thing about all of this is that a lot of those muscles are going to be more tonic than phasic. Tonic just means that they're designed to hold contractions and then release. Phasic means produce a lot of force and then relax and kind of go through their daily life. What's an example of a phasic muscle? Your pec, your bicep, your glutes, to a point your glutes, your hamstrings, quads. What's an example of some more tonic muscles? Multifidi, erector spinae, rectus, the ones that hold you upright and keep you moving. Your soleus is also a big one, and my dogs are barking after walking through Manhattan for the last couple of days. There are muscles that are really easily injured if they have a short moment arm, meaning they stabilize and resist spinal segment movement. So if you crank the spine in big ranges of motion, that's bigger than the range of motion those individual muscles are able to tolerate, which means they're either going to rip, they're going to sprain, or they're going to strain, and there's going to be pain resulted with that, and you have some sort of form of injury. It may not be disc related, but it might be muscle related. The main functions of a lot of the core muscles are allow a transfer of force from the legs to the arms and vice versa. So if you do a jump and you swing your arms, that's a big force transfer to get your lower body to push into your upper body. If you do a push-up, what's the function of your core in that one? To keep your spine together so that your arms can push and your feet can act as a lever and pivot point to be able to generate some power, or to be able to throw. Or as Ronda Rousey found out last night, throw an arm bar. Did anybody see that fight? 14 seconds? Man, I'd be ticked off if I bought that pay-per-view. It resists the deformation of the spine while allowing a high degree of movement from the pelvis and the shoulders. Can I get a volunteer who wants to be a little active participant? Just for a quick demo. I'll pick you since you had your hand up just a split second earlier. All right, so what I want you to do is just turn sideways and then go into just a mild hip hinge for me. Mild hip hinge, good. So what is his spine doing while he's in this position? It's stabilizing, right? So let's say he's playing football and he's on the offensive line. Okay, so don't worry. We'll be good. So you're on the offensive line. So this is what normally a football position would be. They're kind of getting tired. They only have a 30-second or 40-second play clock. So he gets tired and his spine starts to flex. Good. So he's in this position with his head up because he's looking for the defensive crew. He's got the knees lightly bent. This spine now is in a little bit of a flex position. So if an opponent is coming this way at him, what does his spine have to do to be able to not break? Not even get to neutral. Like a lot of guys will just have to get stiff in whatever position they're in. So flex your spine lightly. Good. Now if I load you up this way, you got to maintain and not buttress your spine, right? And if I'm whacking away at you, if you're moving through here, that's where the spot that's going to get injured. A lot of high-level football players or a lot of high-level competitive athletes are great at finding stiffness and stability in whatever position they're comfortable with. Even if he deadlifts with a rounded back, if he locks that in, he'll be okay. If he gets into more of a neutral position, more neutral, good, he's going to have a better chance of buttressing force, but then he's got to use a lot more energy to be there because it takes a lot more energy to be neutral versus just to hang out. So if you're a competitive athlete getting into the end of the fourth quarter of a hard game, where are you more likely to find a lot of your training? Flexion. Because that's where he's got to go because he's so tired at that point, and he's got to learn how to be stable in that flexion position. Now, I'm not going to train him there because he's got to learn how to be able to get as safe as possible in neutral. In neutral, that's where you're going to have the greatest chance of having leverage, but also where you're going to have a safer environment for more people. If he goes into flexion, okay, if he goes even further into flexion, that's potentially a point of injury. If he's up here and that's all he's got available to him, he's only got 1 or 2 inches to go before he has an injury potential, whereas if he's up here, the injury potential is a lot less. I heard those cracking and crunching going on in there, man. You feeling all right? Good, thank you. So the deformation of the spine becomes really important because you want to be able to maintain that integrity from the upper body to the lower body. If I get a blow on my top and I can't resist it properly and my spine turns or buckles or does anything like that, that's an injury waiting to happen. It also assists in breathing mechanics. How many people were finding that yesterday when we were doing some of the breathing stuff that it was a little bit challenging with your ab muscles? You actually felt your ab muscles actually doing something. Today we're going to do a whole lot of breathing. We're going to go from the entire end of the spectrum from low to high, and we're going to do reactive and speed type breathing too. It's going to be boss. Now here's a question for you. Who do you think has the better core overall of any of these people? What's that? Couldn't hear there. What? Relative to the activity, right. So if you look at a power lifter or an Olympic lifter, their core has to do a very specific activity, right? Pull the bar into you, get underneath it, and then drive it up and not break in half. You look at a sprinter, what do they have to be able to do? Generate fast, generate speed, power, punch into the ground, and then be able to generate reactivity from the lower to the upper body. You look at a marathon runner, similar, but what's the difference between him versus him? What's that? Muscle tone, kind of. Tone is kind of a relative term. I would say the endurance of it. I mean, you think about this guy, he's done in 20 seconds. He's done in 2 hours if he's lucky. And you know what it means to run a 2-hour marathon? That's holding 13 miles an hour. I don't know many people who can sprint for 5-10 seconds at 13 miles an hour, let alone run a marathon at 13 miles an hour. That's ridiculous. But you have to figure, he's got to produce force to be able to do that and produce it in a way that's endurance-based so he can last for 2 hours running at a high pace. And then you look at something like this, and that's freak show. So what do you have to do to be able to get into something like this? You have to train your body's ability to move into a direction, relax, but still maintain control. You think that she's not working when she's in that position? Yeah, she's very aware of what her body positioning is, whether or not she's in that point of no return, or if she's on that highway to the danger zone, or whether or not she's just in a safe, happy range. So if she's in a danger position, she's got to know that and be like, oh, I can't go there and pull up. Otherwise, she's going to get injured. Now, these people are able to pretty much fold vertebrae over on top of each other. Their spinous processes are so far away that they've got that range, and their discs are so fluid and elastic that they can just move all over the place. There's a reason why you don't see very many 20 and 30-year-old gymnasts. As we age, we don't maintain that hydration, we don't maintain that elasticity of our tissues. If you see a gymnast, usually they're retired by 16 or 18. That's because they don't have that elasticity anymore. So when it comes to how we train the core, we have two different things that we have to kind of balance. It has to be stiff and stable, but it also has to be elastic and malleable. We have to be able to get into different positions and then lock down in those positions to prevent injury. But then we also have to be resilient enough to move through the entire continuum while being able to control our movements. So it's very much a big balancing act. If you're thinking that you only need to train people in neutral and you only need to train people to get as stiff and tight as possible, what's going to happen when that person is done doing their neutral, stiff and tight training? They're going to walk like this because they're so stiff and rigid. What did we go over with some of the mobility stuff yesterday? Freedom of movement as much as you have available. That passive range of motion and the active range of motion have to be as big as possible. So again, who has the core, or the better core? Has to be stiff enough, elastic enough, deformable enough, fatigue resistant enough, and quick enough at turning on and off. So everyone stand up right now. Let's get you moving just a slight bit. I want you to put a hand on your stomach if you can, and I want you to cough. What did your ab muscles do? Contract, but then what? They're relaxed. Okay. What happens if you contract but you don't relax? And it's like and you have to kind of hold it for a little bit, right? Now I want you to do just almost like a really quick breathe out. Okay? So what did your ab muscles do? Contract and relax. They have to be quick. When you think about anything that's reactive or speed-based, it's all about quick on, quick off. When you think about power lifters, how do they have to be able to breathe and contract their abs? They use a Valsalva, right? And they brace down on top of it. They're not or anything like that because the movement isn't fast, but it's a slow grind. They need to maintain that contraction. So they're going to drop their breathing down, squeeze it as hard as they can, and just crunch everything as hard as possible. Have a seat again. Now the key is that if you're not able to control the core, it's going to get injured. One way or another, you have so many reps of bad quality technique before something goes wrong. You can get away with it for a little while, but just like anything else, you wear it down in a bad position, it's going to break down. When we think about spinal stability, you have to think about it kind of like a ball on a cliff. So if we have a ball sitting on top of a curve like this, how likely is that ball going to roll? Pretty likely. We have a very small range of potential for that person. And this is the frail client who walks into the gym like this because they're so hesitant about any movement. They've got such a small range that they can't really control, or things are going to go sideways really bad. How about a ball like this? Really stable. That ball's not falling off the cliff in any way, shape, or form because the slopes are so high. But you're not going to move it very far one way or another. The range of motion is very small. You look at something like this where it's very robust, you can move it back and forth relatively easily, but it's not going to fall off the cliff. Here it's stable as long as it stays in that one position. If it goes a little bit too far to one side, boom. Too far to one side, boom. So it's one of the best visual representations I've seen on how the spine actually works, because it's great when it's in a range of motion it can control. The bigger that range of motion you can control, the better off that person is going to be. And the bigger you're able to control it by putting up big walls like this, the less chance you're going to have of an injury potentially happening. When we see people, if they've got like disc herniations or spondy or anything like that, what's happened to the robustness and the stability of that spine? It's really been compromised and really reduced. You get people with pars fractures and they try to rotate, it's not going to go too well. Their chances of being injured go way up. Now combine that with the fact that it's not just the muscles that go through alterations in anatomy and adapt to any kind of stresses we see. If we look at the vertebrae themselves, the vertebrae are actually designed to absorb shock. It's not as much the discs. If we look at the structure of the vertebrae, when you see somebody who's been loading it over time, we see a lot of trabecular bone lay down, and we see a lot of crosshatches forming. So that's a vertical loading axis of that vertebral body that's designed to be able to hold a lot of weight and be able to design to adapt to it. We see someone who's got osteopenia, we lose that vertical trabecular bone and a lot of the cross bridges actually start breaking down. And if we look at the concavity of the surface of a lot of those bones, if I press down on it, it's able to press out and stabilize really well. And I've actually seen some videos of fresh vertebral dissections where they pull it out and they show them actually squishing the vertebrae, and you can actually see blood coming in and out of the sinuses. So it acts almost like a hydraulic pump. When we look at the shape of the disc, when we look at something in a car like a strut rod, if it's cracked or worn down, it's going to have a very similar appearance to what an osteopenic or what's the word for if it's really worn down? Osteoporosis, there we go. Too many words in my head right now. Osteoporotic vertebrae on a cross section, it's going to look almost similar to a strut rod bushing that's just cracked, worn down, and breaking out. If we look at a disc, they're not designed necessarily to absorb shock, but they're designed to allow movement. They have a water filling. How good is water at absorbing shock? Not really that great, unless it's a hydraulic pump or unless it's an enclosed environment. You look at the outside lamina, it's not really all that stiff and resilient. So if we're using our disc for shock absorption and we're not using our bone for shock absorption, things are going to go wrong. If we have too much of a flexion or extension one way or another, it starts to break down pretty quickly. So let's say that we put the spine into flexion, we press down on here and we open up on here. What direction is the water going to go? The nucleus is going to migrate this way and it's going to push through a lot of those layers of the disc and eventually cause a herniation. So when we start looking at how the structure of the body is set up, the bones are going to be your shock absorber and the discs are going to be allowing you to move. If we put too much pressure on the discs as a mobile sector and try to make it a shock absorber, it's going to go wrong and we're going to have herniations. So when we think about the function of low back, with spinal stability, core muscles have to be down-regulated if there's not enough stability in the spine. So has anybody ever had a back injury before? What happens to the muscles right around that area? They're tight, but do they fire up hard? They're just usually on, right? They don't fire fast, they don't relax fast, but they're usually just in almost like a guarding tension. Muscles around them tend to release as well because they don't want to cause further damage. The muscles that you'll usually see down-regulate the most are your transverse and your site-specific multifidi. So this is where the Australian method of core training came in. They saw that, yeah, your transverse goes offline and your site-specific multifidus goes offline. So what's the logical conclusion of that? Well, train the transverse, train the multifidi. It doesn't really produce as much of a result as you would want because those are muscles that are offline in a protective guarding mechanism to try to not do further damage to that site. So if we try to train those muscles, do they come online on their own? It's very difficult to do. But if you brace the entire core and provide that stability, then those muscles will actually fire right up. I've actually seen deep EMG analysis that's actually shown if you do brace work, it actually pulls your transverse on faster than if you try to do the transverse specific draw-in methods or hollows or anything like that. That lack of muscular support leads to more instability, which leads to more pain and dysfunction, less robust movements, less stable movements going on. The end of pain usually doesn't mean that you've restored the structure, and it doesn't mean that you've restored the function of the area. It just means currently you're not irritating those tissues enough to produce pain. Like you could be laying in bed and perfectly fine. That doesn't mean you're healed. It just means you're currently not in pain, you're not irritating those tissues. When you get up and do a movement that might irritate it, that's going to produce more pain. So that anterior instability is usually going to be things like a really, really tight psoas and a really reduced rectus. So the abdomen here, it's not going to be firing as hard, but your hip flexors are going to be firing hard. The hip flexors, the psoas, are going to be directly attaching up through that line onto the lumbar spine. So they're providing a lot of anterior stabilization on that. And the rectus abdominis, they're just not hanging on because they're kind of relaxing and not compressing the spine as much anymore. So how many people know people that chronically have to stretch out their tight hip flexors? All the time, all the time, all the time, all the time. And they do something like this, where you have lumbar extension and anterior pelvic tilt. Yeah, you can stretch out your psoas, but why is your psoas tight in the first place? It's trying to hold your spine together. So you keep stretching it out and it keeps staying tight. What are you actually doing? It's like banging your head against the wall and wondering why you have a headache. Right? You just keep doing the exact same thing. What do you think would be better in this instance than trying to constantly stretch out your hip flexors? Reintegrate core bracing. You do that, hip flexors loosen up on their own because now they don't have to provide this stability for your spine. They're getting that from somewhere else, and your body doesn't have to go into emergency autopilot. This is a really cool drawing from Leonardo da Vinci. So centuries ago, he was looking at anatomy back when you couldn't do anatomy. And I mean, when I say you couldn't do anatomy, like it was illegal to cut into bodies. Like the church said you could not desecrate a human body in any way, shape, or form because it was against God's will. So in that aspect, he had to envision what the muscles were and think it through. But he had a pretty good representation of what was going on. When you look at something like this, it almost looks like the mast of what would be on a ship to hold up that sail. When you look at the structure of the neck, he's pretty close to it. I mean, you don't have the individual fibers coming out here, but you have things like the traps going all the way up the neck, and then you have levator scapula. You don't have as many top-down mastheads going on. When you look at how the spine is actually structured, it's very much like this. It's not one muscle controlling the spine, it's thousands of individual muscles grouping together into sheaths that allow for large movements, small movements, and very fine, precise movement adjustment to be able to get the body going. Any questions on any of that so far? Clear as mud? Ready to rock? All right, good. Now let's look at what happens with breathing. If we were to breathe and pull the diaphragm into a position where we do like a Valsalva, and then brace down on top of it, that increases a lot of intra-abdominal pressure. So if we have a large increase in pressure in here, what do you think happens if we have a weak spot anywhere in that entire abdominal core region? You're gonna have pressure pushing out into it. So if you have somebody that's got, let's say, a pelvic floor dysfunction, what do you think they're gonna feel whenever they increase that intra-abdominal pressure? They're gonna feel a lot of pressure pushing down in that pelvic floor. And that's where things like prolapse happen. And guys can have weak pelvic floors as well. It's not just females who've had pregnancies or anything like that. You can also have dysfunction on the front of the abdomen through the linea alba. You can actually have a separation of that where you have a diastasis. Guys can get that too. I actually have one. I've got about a 3-finger diastasis in between my second and third abdomen up here. You can also have things like lumbar expansion, all that kind of fun stuff. So controlling the pressure when you're breathing becomes really important. If you have any ability to learn different things about breathing mechanics, like yoga does great jobs at teaching breathing, Pilates does great jobs at teaching breathing. I took a course on hypopressive breathing that's all about negative intra-abdominal pressure that's used to draw up the pelvic floor and create almost like an involuntary contraction in it. So it's really been powerful for a lot of the clients that I work with who have pelvic floor dysfunctions, prolapse, incontinence, all that kind of fun stuff that nobody wants to talk about in the gym. But there's actually a large growing body of research that shows about 4 out of 10 women experience stress incontinence while working out. So if you're training women, that's probably something you want to know about, especially if you're getting them doing things like box jumps, double unders, heavy squats and deadlifts. Are they able to control their pelvic floor? It's a very professional conversation that you have to have with them, but it's something that can affect their workout quality. When we start going into Valsalvas, we have that big increase in pressure and you lock down on top of it. Now, if you're not controlling that pressure properly as you come back up and you release pressure before you get to the top range, what do you think happens? You decrease that pressure, you actually go through something called a vasovagal moment with your blood pressure. So your blood pressure drops. And what happens when your blood pressure drops? Very suddenly, nighty-night, you're going out. So you see this on like weightlifting fails videos on YouTube all the time. Guys get up through the movement, they pass out. There's that one amazing video of the guy who deadlifts 315. He's like, yeah, and then he passes out into the dumbbell racks. He didn't manage his breathing through the lift. So when you're doing this, it's really important to not just manage how you're breathing, but the response afterwards. And a lot of it isn't just going to be muscular, it's going to be vascular as well. You have to be able to control breathing. If you don't do it properly, you're going to have some bad results. I was working with one guy who was doing front squats in a Smith machine. I know Smith machine, but whatever. It was right for him at that point in time because he needed the control of the movement. He was coming up out of the movement and he breathed out, not through a small, quick control like that, but and he let everything go. He came up and he's like, oh God, I got a headache now. He wound up having a very mild infarction, very mild stroke from not managing his breathing properly. So at that point I was like, okay, we can't do any more loaded stuff like that because he didn't manage how he was breathing. He increased intracranial pressure and wound up popping a small blood vessel in his brain. It wasn't to the point where he had a big bleed or he had to have surgery or anything like that, but it was big enough where it showed up on a CT scan, but it healed on its own. So breathing is very important when it comes to managing stress in a training scenario. And it's something I can't stress enough, like you have to be with your clients and teach them the mechanics of how to breathe through power before you load them up. If you just throw weight on the bar, bad things are gonna happen. So I use this example with Ruthless Mobility as far as breathing mechanics gone wrong. This is a young hockey player at rest. And if you look at how his rib position is, he's really expanded out like that and he's really dropped in and very, very hollow in this position. So what do you think's going on with his diaphragmatic breathing or with his rib breathing? He's not getting much diaphragmatic breathing at all. He breathes by opening his ribs wider and wider. And you can see, like, these aren't ribs on the side. Those are his intercostal muscles. Like, they're pretty thick and meaty suckers, so they're ready to go. When you're breathing, you have to be able to get kind of triple expansion. You raise your ribs, you expand your ribs, and you expand your abdomen. We can do that diaphragmatic pressure point where we actually see whether or not the diaphragm presses out. But that's just a fun thing to be able to do to get people to learn how to get their diaphragm moving. You hook underneath the ribs, and then when they breathe in, do the fingers push out, or do they stay underneath when they breathe? So if I breathe in and I don't use my diaphragm, my fingers stay underneath my ribs. If I breathe in and use my diaphragm, my fingers get pushed right out. Very easy rib hook. I talked about this already, but we'll go into the fun stuff. Now, the diaphragm is actually a muscle that I think is more integral to movement than it is to breathing. I think it's more of a breathing accessory muscle and a movement primary muscle. Anytime we're doing any movement of the peripheral body, it has to involve diaphragmatic contraction. The results indicate contraction of the diaphragm contributes to increased abdominal pressure prior to the initiation of large, not small, segments of the upper limb. The contraction is independent of the phase of respiration. So what does this mean? It's independent of the phase of respiration. So whether you're inhaling, exhaling, doing anything like that, the diaphragm will contract to pre-stabilize the spine and the core before movement initiation. So if you do muscle movement of your deltoids or anything along that line, the diaphragm contracts about 20 milliseconds before the initiation of contraction of any of the limb extremities. So when you get to a point like that, the diaphragm is going to be contracting, and it's going to do that to preset the core, preset the spine before upper limb movement or lower limb movement even. And it's going to do that whether you're breathing in, breathing out, at rest, at whatever phase. So it's almost like it's the preset muscle before any movement occurs. Diaphragm is massively important. So with breathing, the diaphragm is going to be the roof and that main anchor point for a lot of the core muscles going in through here. So it's going to be an anchor for the psoas, the rectus, the transverse, multifidus, all of those anchors are going to be here. There's also pillars that go right down and attach into the pelvic floor. So at that point, there's a lot of interconnectivity going on. Inhalation drives diaphragm distally. It pushes it down, increases pressure in abdominal cavity. Abdominal distension, we see people that develop kind of a pressure belly. Have you ever seen competitive strongmen or powerlifters? They're usually right out to here. They might only have a body composition around 20%, but they've got these guts that just hang out like this, massive pressure bellies, because that diaphragm drives right down into it. And if anyone's ever taken workshops with Louis Simmons, the guy who runs Westside Barbell, he has this great drill where he gets people to take their fist and push it into his stomach as hard as they can, and he goes like this, and he just contracts and shoots their hand out from them, just with diaphragmatic and abdominal control. Bang, pressure's out. We have instantaneous stabilization that uses short, choppy exhalations. So we want to get those movements down. We want to be able to produce that power breathing. You ever see when martial artists throw any kind of punch? They don't go. It's usually because they want to generate snap and power and pulse. And it's that instantaneous stiffening of the entire system. Like Bruce Lee said, water, 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 stone. As soon as you make that connection, bang, your body turns to rock. And if your body is loose when you make that connection, you're either going to break your wrist, your elbow, your shoulder, your back, something's going to go wrong. But if you're nice and smooth and fluid, and when you get there, bang, you just lock right into it, that's when you're going to have the greatest chance of not just saving yourself, but causing untold damage to your opponent. You want to make sure that you win the battle, right? So you want to be able to turn to stone as hard as you can, as fast as you can. So those movements of stiffness with relaxation, water, 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 stone, and then right back to water again. If you ever listen to Georges St. Pierre talk about how he fights, whenever he's throwing a kick or anything like that, he says, I think boom, boom. So it's the initiation and then connection. So he's trying to contract to start the movement, yeah, and then when he gets to the end point, bang, he wants to be able to contract and produce boom, boom. So it's that two hit, really quick and sudden. It's not one smooth contraction all the way through, it's float, bang, connect. So when we're trying to produce any kind of power, it's water, 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 stone. And you have to have that if you want to be stable when you're doing any kind of high speed, high velocity contractions. Otherwise, things are going to get injured. Now, this is a really cool chart that shows an outline of intra-abdominal and transdiaphragmatic pressure with different types of activity. So if we use maximal inhalatory pressure, we get way, way, way up here. So way into the power reading of kilopascals of pressure. If we think about something like a sit-up, about 60% of what maximal inhalation power would be. A sniff, just doing that, 80% of maximal inhalation power. So when we start thinking about how exercise develop pressure through the system, we think about how power breathing actually plays a role. Maximal inhalatory pressure, that's as much as you can possibly get. So that's, and loading it up. a sniff, very quick, maybe like 1/10 of the amount of time, creates so much pressure drive and velocity of air coming through your system that it just power loads you up. For any power lifters or Olympic lifters, what's one of the things they teach you how to do before you start? Stomps for creating a neural drive through your power, and power breathe. And if you have a little bit of ammonia salts to go with that, that's even better. Oh, geez. Get you really fired up. Then we start thinking about things like being in a 45-degree lean position, doing a crunch, doing any kind of ankle touch movements, doing any kind of single leg lifts, doing rest, pelvic tucks. Those all create different diaphragmatic pressures, but they're not necessarily driven on breathing. When you start thinking about breathing exercises, actual breathing like maximal inhalatory and sniffing, that creates that big pressure change across the diaphragm and actually builds up a lot more stiffness through here. That's why breathing is so important. That's why when we start doing things like that, that short, choppy exhalation, it creates so much pressure through the entire system that it stabilizes that spine instantly. So if we want to preset the body, we don't want to do very relaxed, easy breathing. We want to be able to do short, choppy power breathing if we're looking for speed. If we're looking to shut down the system that's very sympathetically stimulated and we want to be able to bring the person back to neutral, yeah, we have to do relaxed breathing. We want to create mobility, that's different. We have to do more relaxed parasympathetic breathing. Long, deep inhalation, exhalation. There's a time and place for everything. If people are always doing parasympathetic style breathing, they're not going to generate power. Anatomically, it just doesn't line up. If you're always doing short, choppy breathing, you're never going to relax. You're going to be expending a lot of energy. You're going to be burnt out and fatigued. So we want to be able to have a little bit of everything going on. Now, a downside to creating too much pressure across the system is when we start seeing dysfunctions occur. Things like that diastasis, where we have a separation of the linea alba of the rectus. So this is where we have too much pressure pushing out and it literally rips this way. So when we have something like that, it's typically found in women later stages of pregnancy, like second and third trimester, where the pressure of the fetus developing pushes out and it just creates a rip. Guys can get that too. So if you ever see a guy doing a sit or a crunch or any kind of core-centric exercise where they're laying on their back and they get kind of this pyramid shape coming out of the middle of their abdomen here, where just kind of this line here pops up and it almost looks like a hard ridge, that's a diastasis. So if you have something like that, it is correctable, but the person has to really work at it, reduce the level of the abdominal intensity, but it's showing you that there's a rip in the abdominal wall. It's not a herniation, but it's a separation. So maybe like 2 or 3 layers of the abdomen have actually broken apart instead of having all of them go out at once. Think of it sort of like, have you ever seen a garden hose that's got the bulge on it? Where the integrity of the wall's broken down? The water still flows through it, but it's just got that bulge where it's broken down. That's essentially what's happening here. A herniation is where there's a hole in the hose and water's gushing out that one. So it's not a herniation, but it's just a weakness in the layer. Now, physiotherapy is really great at being able to help with this, and you can do some types of core contractions with training. But the thing is that if you start seeing stuff like this, that's showing you that the abdominal integrity isn't maximal or something is altered with it. So that's when you got to start paying attention and back off on intensity and make sure the person can live to train another day. So what directions does the spine have to be mobile in and be stable in? Well, first, there's compression. The spine has to be able to resist loading going vertically on top of it. If you have somebody that's got end plate fractures or discogenic changes, they might have some difficulty with any kind of compression. And there's distraction, separation of the discs. If they've sprained ligaments or muscles, strains or anything like that, they're going to have pain and torture with that. Shear. If they have anything like a spondy or if they've had a pars fracture or anything like that with the spine, it's going to become problematic when they start going like this. For me, I've got a bit of shear intolerance in my spine, and whenever I deadlift, I have to really brace down hard on top of it. Otherwise, it buckles on me. So based on that, I have to really watch what I do. Then we can go through flexion extension cycles. If somebody is flexion intolerant, they might have disc herniation issues or bulges or something along that lines. We might have a combination of like compression, shear, flexion. Has anyone ever watched Family Guy before? Lift with your knees in a bending twist, or take your knees completely out of the equation, lift with your back in a jerking, twisting manner. And all of a sudden he's in the hospital. Lateral flexion can be a fun one too. So instead of just being anterior, posterior flexion, you could have a lateral flexion aspect going on. So if we have any intolerance or pain with a certain type of movement or a direction of movement, we have to be aware of that. So what does it mean if somebody has like a shear intolerance in their spine? What movements do you think you should avoid? Anything that puts shear into the spine. So if I'm in a position almost like a plank, I can manage that for a little while, but if I get uncontrolled in that, it might produce some pain or problems. Deadlifting, reverse hyperextensions, back extensions, stuff like that, where the spine is being exposed to gravitational load and it has to go like this or resist against going this way. Okay? So if I have pain with those movements, we have to be able to control the movement as best as possible, but not push into it very much. If somebody is able to do a hip hinge, like just reaching back, and that doesn't produce any pain in their spine, okay, we can start progressing onto it. But if that produces pain just by doing that movement, we can't do any hip hinge training with them until their pain is resolved. That might mean sending them out for therapy. That might mean training them on how to condition the movements, how to condition their spine. But try to avoid training painful movements because it's only going to sensitize the person to more pain. What about flexion intolerance? What would be some example of movements that you would do in flexion intolerance? Ab wheel could be shear intolerance. It could be flexion intolerance if the person's flexing into it, right? So it's the movement, not the moment. If you're flexing like this, what would be an example of a movement like that? Crunches, exactly, right? A crunch is a flexion movement of the spine. If you have flexion intolerance, that's going to hurt, right? If you're doing the leg raises where your knees are coming up to your chest, that's an example of flexion intolerance. We could have any one direction or combination of it. If we have that intolerance present, train around it, don't train that movement direction, get them checked out. We can retrain the body's ability to resist that movement and be able to stabilize against it. So that's where we get into the differentiation of movement versus moment. So if I'm doing an anti-extension movement, what would be an example of that? A dead bug, exactly. So the movement isn't going into extension, but the moment arm is creating that movement direction, the loading, pulling you into extension, and you have to resist against it. So everyone knows what a dead bug is? We're going to go through a breakdown on it later on too, so we'll go through like the very, very finite details of everything. Then we have to look at the geometry of the movement too. So if we think about the moment arm, that's the direction of pull from the load. So the load is up here, the moment arm pulling on the back is down here. The movement arm is what direction the movement's actually going. So we're moving from a position of neutral into extension with the spine. So that's the movement. What's the direction the moment is pulling you into? If I get down here, it wants to pull me into flexion. So that's the moment direction. If I'm thinking movement direction, that's completely different. It's going to be, am I moving with the weight that it's pulling me into, or am I moving against it? Now if I have a flexion moment, but there's no movement going on in my spine, is it still flexion? Yes, I'm just stabilizing against that flexion. So if I have a flexion intolerance, moment arms that are involving flexion are okay as long as you stabilize and don't allow the spine to go into flexion. Flexion movements are a different, it just creates a rip. Guys can get that too. So if you ever see a guy doing a sit or a crunch or any kind of core-centric exercise where they're laying on their back and they get kind of this pyramid shape coming out of the middle of their abdomen here, where just kind of this line here pops up and it almost looks like a hard ridge, that's a diastasis. So if you have something like that, it is correctable, but the person has to really work at it, reduce the level of the abdominal intensity, but it's showing you that there's a rip in the abdominal wall. It's not a herniation, but it's a separation. So maybe like 2 or 3 layers of the abdomen have actually broken apart instead of having all of them go out at once. Think of it sort of like, have you ever seen a garden hose that's got the bulge on it? Where the integrity of the wall's broken down. The water still flows through it, but it's just got that bulge where it's broken down. That's essentially what's happening here. A herniation is where there's a hole in the hose and water's gushing out that one. So it's not a herniation, but it's just a weakness in the layer. Now physiotherapy is really great at being able to help with this, and you can do some types of core contractions with training. But the thing is that if you start seeing stuff like this, that's showing you that the abdominal integrity isn't maximal or something is altered with it. So that's when you got to start paying attention and back off on intensity and make sure the person can live to train another day. So what directions does the spine have to be mobile in and be stable in? Well, first, there's compression. They are beat up. Give them 2 weeks on that job, how are they feeling? They're whistling, singing, throwing stuff around. They go home, they're not feeling bad at all. They go take a vacation. They don't throw a single bag of garbage the entire week they're on vacation. The next day they come back to work, how do they feel? A little bit horrible, right? A little bit beat up. They train into it, they get used to it, they get used to that stress, they find a way to get through it. That doesn't mean they're not going to get injured, but it just means they find a way to get it done that's less energetically costly and training the system to be able to handle the load. So if we have somebody who's doing something like this, and they were moving just with neutral spine all the time, they'd eventually break down. Something would go wrong, just due to the fact they would fatigue. And fatigue changes the rules of any movement we do. We're always going to default to what's easiest. If we were sitting in an office, Slouching with your head slightly forward is easier because it allows you to see things better. It doesn't allow you to expend as much mental energy, and it makes you just kind of hang on fascial tension. After a while, though, that fascial tension either deforms or it breaks down, and we wind up with some sort of injury. So we always have to be aware that the cost of doing business for stuff like this, it's easier, but you might get injured sooner. But it's easier. So you have to balance out easy with fatigue. Stuff like this, though, just makes me not know what to do with myself. Like, if you see people purposely going into the gym and looking like a question mark and saying, I want to round my back because I can make it a pull easier. Oh my God. Disc's going to shoot across the room and take somebody's eye out. This, I don't know what this guy's doing. He's using a hack squat machine backwards like a straight leg deadlift. And I snuck that picture and I went up to him afterwards. I was like, I've never seen somebody do that before. Why are you doing it like that? Just curious. I just want to know what you're getting out of it. Because I don't want to be the jerk who goes up to somebody who's like, you're doing that wrong. All of a sudden, now I'm the jackass who said something to a client and is like, no, they don't like me anymore. So he says, oh, it's a great exercise. I really feel it in my lower back. It's a great stretch. Yeah, I don't doubt you feel it in your lower back. That's all that's doing work. But I mean, people are left to their own devices are going to become really creative. They might not do things that are going to be longevity producing, but they're going to find ways to make movement occur. If you can coach this out, and if you can coach this out so the low back isn't doing all of the movement, and you get the hips to do more movement, their longevity in the gym is going to be way better, and they'll probably lift more weight too. So big things to be aware of when you have things like shear. That's where you have that vertebral shift. Spondylolisthesis is a fun word to break out at parties. If you want to, bust that sucker out tonight and tomorrow and just see how many people roll their eyes at you. If you have a spondy, that's a massive shear instability. That's where the vertebrae are actually repositioned into an anterior or posterior position. So at that point, if you think of the central canal where the spinal cord goes, you've changed the alignment, and that spinal cord now is probably getting pinched off between those two vertebrae. Has anyone seen a cigar cutter? That's the same concept as a spondy in terms of the central canal and shear. If that shears too far forward, you can actually sever the spinal cord. So you have to be very cautious with stuff like that. When you think about the multifidus and its actual usage, it angles into the vertebral column at about a 45-degree angle. So the cosine of 45 is 0.707. Which means that the multifidi is responsible for reduction of about 70% of the shear force the spine gets exposed to. How's that for some mathematical science? Bam. So that shear resistance trains the moment, things like hip hinge, co-contraction, bracing without overextension. So when you see people deadlift and they come up and they go like this to lock out, what are they just doing to their spine? They're massively extended, but also they're driving shear force into that spine even harder. With a lot of people, if they have low back pain, and I say, when do you get low back pain? Oh, I only get it when I deadlift. I'm not going to go through a full assessment on the individual. I'll say, okay, show me your deadlift. What do you think needs to happen with the deadlift? They might need to be coached on it. If it only hurts when they do that one activity, show me that activity and let me break it down for you. I had one guy, he would deadlift and he'd get up to here and just lock out. Of course your lower back's going to be sore. Get his hips to come all the way through, no pain anymore. We reduced the shear force on his spine, saved him from years of crippling agony. Now this is cool. This is Tiger's old swing. Everyone knows who Tiger Woods is, right? If you look at the line of his spine as it comes through here and how much rotation he gets, he's a pretty supple guy. And there's a big controversy going on right now. Oh, he lifted too much weight, he lifted too much weight. He was as big then when his back didn't hurt. So did he lift too much weight? Look at his swing now. See how stiff it looks? So he's resisting movement through it all the way. So he's probably developed a rotational intolerance. If you consider how many swings a golfer takes on a daily basis, how many rotations through that spine, fatigue is going to set in. It just has to happen. Let's look at the first one again. So see how much of a lateral shift he's getting up here, how much rotation he's getting thoracolumbar region, and how much of a finished position he's getting through his spine? Like that's a really big rotation going on. We consider that to something like here, we can see he's not getting his spine around as much. We can see here he's not getting as much lateral flexion coming through his spine, and his finished position, his hips and his shoulders are pretty much matching up. So in terms of his stabilization of his spine, yeah, he's doing a way better job at that, but it's probably out of necessity. He probably has rotation or even a shear intolerance, so when he comes around that corner, if he doesn't control it properly, he buckles. And he's had back issues, he's had knee issues on his stance leg, so he's had to change his foot position around. And as a result, he's had to alter things so that he can continue to play. When you talk to guys that are actually trainers in the PGA, they'll say there's no golfer out there who doesn't have a bad back. They just manage the pain. Why? Their activity creates a unilateral rotational force that's how they get the ball in the hole. If they don't do that, they don't make money. And after 30, 40, 50 years of doing that, you're gonna break down. Any unilateral sport is gonna see unilateral wear. You keep doing that enough, you're gonna see problems. Now when you get into that movement intolerance, things like flexion, this is primarily gonna be things that are disc, posterior lateral ligament structures, neural impingements. So there's a lot of ways that you can check for whether or not a person has a disc or neural impingement in a manual setting. What do you think the gold standard is to see whether or not someone's got a disc issue? MRI. It's the only way you can really do it. So for that, you gotta refer out. You gotta make sure the person's getting checked. But from a movement intolerance aspect, again, hip hinge. Can they maintain neutral spine and maintain a chest up position? From there, that's maintaining that neutral without going into flexion. From after that, can they do something like a knee raise? If I get a client to just do a knee raise, do they go into flexion or do they maintain a neutral position? A lot of people will wind up existing in their movement intolerance. So if you have somebody that's got a flexion intolerance, what position do you think they're going to come into you with? They'll be flexed. They'll sit in a chair in flexion. And they'll also tend to explore their available range of motion before pain happens. They want to stretch, they want to check it out, they want to see how far they can move. They'll be like, oh man, it's really tight today. And they just keep doing the same movement that's creating pain. It's almost like they're doing a self-analysis to try to see how far they can take it before pain finally starts. But what do you think happens when they take it to that limit? They become sensitized to it. So they're always searching for it and they're always kind of moving deeper into it. You got a lot of people, when I have people coming in for assessments, they sit out in a waiting area and they sit there for a little while. So I'll go to the other side of the gym and I'll kind of watch them. I'll just see how they're sitting. And you can usually get an idea of how a person's moving or what's going on just by seeing them sit. If they're sitting bolt upright like this and they kind of have to stand and move around, okay, extension intolerance. Because they can't sit and go into anything other than flexion. If they sit in the chair and they're kind of flexed and they're kind of bracing in it, okay, probably flexion intolerant. If they stand up and they're like this, flexion intolerance. If they sit and they kind of have to lean to one side, probably rotational intolerance. Maybe disc herniation to one side. So just watching somebody how they sit in a chair can tell you an idea of what they can or they can't do. For extension intolerance, things like TL hinge. If they do any overhead work and they get a really big hinge right at that TL junction, that thoracolumbar junction, where the vertebrae just folds in half, big sign that there's a movement dysfunction going on. Rib flare, if they get that big rib expansion happening. The breathing restriction, if they have anything like a budding of the spinous processes. If you have the chance to look at x-rays, you'll actually see on the bottom of the spinous process of the lumbar spine, if they are living in extension and just driving into it, those spinous processes are going to turn white because they're developing a lot of bone-to-bone scarring and they're just literally angling into each other. So for things like that, if they're in flexion or extension movement intolerance, the best thing we can start working on is dead bugs, planks, and then get them to just lock out any kind of issues that they're having. So if they're always in flexion, say, okay, you got to stand up. If they're always living in extension, okay, you got to pull your ribs in. Just get them back to neutral. If you get them back to neutral, that's going to fix up a lot of problems people have when they have certain movement intolerances. Then you get them to own that neutral position in anything that they're doing and then slowly expand that movement window. Because if they can't move from neutral, they don't go any further than neutral. Pain is one of those fun things that you got to be really aware of. So now we're going to break out into some of the major stages of how to go through core conditioning. So this is a flow I use with any of my clients to be able to determine what we should be doing at that point in time. So it goes from very easy, where it's the injury rehab, prehab aspect, all the way up to the elite athletes. Now I've been fortunate enough to train people post-surgical for disc issues, been training people pre-surgical for spinal issues, congenital diseases, disorders, all the way up to Olympic athletes, and we'll still follow this schema. Just due to the fact that it's one of the ways that I found progresses people up easiest and builds on previous material really well. Now, if you've got Olympic caliber athletes who are injured, you still have to start them down here. They still have to regain control of that movement, but you still have to be aware of their performance. They still have to be able to go out there, earn their spot on the team, and still win competitions. So let's look at the major tenets when we start looking at isolational work. For one, breathing. They have to be able to own breathing mechanics without fatiguing or flailing or moving into a different position. Now when they're breathing, there's two different things you got to think of. Do they have freedom of movement? And then can they lock their core down and then breathe behind the shield? So has anyone heard that term before? breathing behind the shield. If you're doing power or strength exercise or any kind of core stabilization exercises, one of the big complaints you'll have from a lot of people is that when they're contracting, it's hard to breathe. That's good. It should be hard to breathe. What does that make them have to do? They got to work at it. They got to earn that breathing. So you got to train them to get them to breathe behind bracing. What do you think happens if they say, oh, I can't brace and breathe at the same time? What's going to happen when they try to breathe? They lose their brace. And then that's when the injury is going to happen. Okay, well, you got to brace, hold it, and breathe at the same time. Doesn't matter whether it's a isolational, integrated, or neural. They got to be able to brace and breathe. Then we got to look at posture. Where do we start? Neutral. Start neutral and move out from there. If the person can't get to neutral without pain, start them as close to it as possible without pain. From there, when they can own neutral position, then we can start moving them away from it. But we always have to start at neutral. After that, we do short work with longer rest, low rate of perceived exertion, and very high focus. These exercises are going to be more mentally demanding than physically demanding. And we get people into positions where they're really working hard at it, they're going to be taxed. You're going to be burning a lot of glucose in the brain. They're going to be seeing fat loss coming from the brain cells. Back on this one, when I say short work, this might be 2 reps. It might be 3 or 4 reps. We might only be doing 5 to 10 second braces. But it's working on just getting them to establish that ability to do it and then relax. I don't want to fatigue them in these positions, because what happens when we fatigue? We start calling up new systems, we start calling up compensation patterns. We don't want to have fatigue when we're in an isolational model. We want to make sure that that person's able to own that position, rest, relax. And they might need extended rest periods. Do you have a question on that one, Matt?
Basically, you're just saying, like, so you're creating neural patterns, right? So you're
creating neural patterns, yes.
Kind of like a memory regress. So by doing it for like 2 or 3 seconds, you're just
Yep.
creating kind of like a map.
Yeah, we're creating a neural memory with it, but we're also creating just that initial stimulus without fatiguing it. So for these guys, if we were to do a minute hold on someone who has no ability to control bracing, they're eventually going to start going into a new pattern. So then we're just training that new pattern that we didn't want in the first place, or I should say an old pattern that they're not used to. So we get them to own it, lock it down, relax. Then we get them to own it, lock it down, relax, and then we get them to extend that period as we go. So think about it sort of like shooting a free throw, right? How many times do you shoot a free throw to get good at it? A lot, right? And you don't do it by doing one long free throw. You don't get better at free throws by shooting half-court shots, right? You get better at shooting free throws by shooting free throws. Brace, relax. Okay, get that exact same brace again and relax. If you shoot a free throw and then you shoot a free throw hook style, you're not shooting the same free throw, right? It's repetition, 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 ingraining that motor pattern, getting that motor engram down, making sure they can own that neutral. From there, then we can get them up and doing different things, but they got to own that position first. Technique is going to be a paramount. Yeah, question?
Just go over what causes fat loss again in the brain.
Glycolysis, because your brain burns through glucose, and that's the only fuel source it has. And when people are thinking really fast and really hard, they're going to be burning through a lot of glucose. But think of it this way, like, have you ever studied hard for exams? You know how tired you get? And it's not just mental, it's physical tired. I'm not saying like thinking is going to be the new fat loss trend or anything like that. That's just a joke. But it's just a joke, don't worry about it. I get you. When we start working in isolational type work, we got to think positional breathing. It's going to change when we move from a position on your back to quadruped to half kneeling to tall kneeling to standing. It's going to change, so we have to reinforce it all the way through. Things like the dead bug, the bird dog, the plank, we got to go front and side, half kneeling, full kneeling. All of these types of positions are going to become very important when we start looking at how the body actually breaks in.